And in general, the environment, I would say, is that while it appears that the Democratic Party is coming up with a big effort here for the next election, I'm not so sure, because the Democrats are actually slipping behind in terms of the presidential race right now. What that means is uncertain, but my reading is that Obama could be thrown out of the presidency, or at least not reelected, renominated, very soon, because there's a lot of instability. And thus, obviously, everything we discuss is going to be affected by what the prospects are as we go toward November of what is the future of the United States. Because if Obama were reelected, or even renominated, that is something bad. But if he were reelected, that's a threat to all humanity. And so we're coming into that kind of interesting period where we have to keep an eye on, shall we say, on everything we discuss. We have to keep an eye on this kind of consideration.
Yeah, I think it's important to just re-emphasize the real danger, the immediate danger we have with Obama being in the White House. I mean, the best of all possible events would be if the Congress would come back and yank Obama out immediately, and then we could actually rebuild the country from that standpoint. But the immediate threat is represented by two things. One is a video that we just put out on the site called Unsurvivable, which illustrates what a real thermonuclear war scenario looks like, and the immediate threat that we have of that unraveling very quickly within the next possible days to weeks to months under an Obama presidency. But then the other material that we're about to release, which we talked about a lot, is it's a follow-up to what we put out earlier in the year, the Planetary Defense Report, which is a response to the Russian proposal for strategic defense of the Earth. We're about to put out a second, kind of like a follow-up issue, a crisis pamphlet, detailing one aspect of it, which has been covered pretty often. It's on asteroid defense. And I think it's important to look at where Obama comes on both of these issues. They're both extinction threats. Thermonuclear war is as much an extinction threat as something like a major asteroid impact on the Earth. And Obama right now is right in the middle of both of them. On the one hand, going for thermonuclear war with Russia, China, and everything that's involved in that. But then also in shutting down our space program. A great victory of the space program we just saw with the landing of Curiosity on Mars. But the context of that is that the Obama administration is hell-bent to shut down our abilities in mastering outer space, putting people in outer space, and controlling the region, the inner region of the solar system, which is just as dangerous, although it's potentially a longer-term threat. It's still an extinction threat for the human race. So what I wanted to go through is just a little bit of some of what's going to be in this pamphlet and what the larger issues are to recontextualize it. Because, the Russians have proposed their strategic defense of the Earth, and they've re-proposed it several times. And right now there's a conference going on in the greater Russian Ukrainian area, which addresses some of this topic. The way you defend against asteroids is not just by putting guns and bombs in space to blow them up or move them. It's a much larger issue that involves the relationship between human creativity on the one hand and the issue of relativistic space-time on the other. What is this solar system that we're dealing with? What is the context that something like an asteroid impact, what is the context that we have to see that inside of? So it's an issue of the mind of man and controlling not just things that are hurtling through space with other things, but understanding what are the processes that drive changes in the solar system, which have to be seen as Einstein saw the universe in terms of general relativity and space-time.
First of all, I think there are several things we should be actually considering. By breaking out free of certain bounds we put upon our imagination. One of these is the way we interpret things biologically. And this has a whole lot of errors in it. Now, how did this come about? If you go back to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, you find that there are three figures who were exceptionally important from a standpoint of retrospective views from now. Planck, Einstein, Wolfgang Köhler. And because these, and also the other thing is the question of what is the meaning of the speed of light, which is this apparent limitation which we're dealing with. And now we also have the fact of one thing: the speed of light implies we can reach Mars by the speed of light if we can use the speed of light as a communication system, which is what we're trying to do. Which means that we have changed the reference, and we now have said, wait a minute, but what about biology? What about the definition of the way we define life? Isn't that a little bit absurd when we consider that these other considerations are entering, such as the function of the human mind? And therefore, we are actually to have two problems. One, we had what happened with World War I and the approach to it, which was a destruction of science, a destruction of the pushing forward of science on these fundamental questions, and the trying to interpret everything from a standpoint of more limited data, or qualities of data. Now we've come to the point where, with the use of the speed of light, which is the only way we can efficiently control this operation on Mars, that we've now changed it. Now we still don't know what the speed of light means. We just know it's a phenomenon which has been validated. And we're trying now to estimate things from that standpoint. What this means is we no longer are relying upon so-called biological processes. Not that they don't exist. In fact, they do exist. They're very important. But we don't have the basis on which to understand them properly. That's the problem. And what we do with trying to interpret things from a biological standpoint, we overlook the fact that biology itself is a very, very curious thing. There is no such thing as biology as such. There is something which we explain by biology, as life explained by biology. And life is unique. Well, instead of saying biology, why don't we say life? Life as a principle, the principle of the universe, which can be measured in terms of what the basic speeds are in the universe, what's relationships of space in terms of this. Why don't we try to understand what the word life should mean? Because it's unique as a principle. It's not something you can adduce from something else. It is a principle of the universe. And so therefore the problem now is we've shut off things because of Bertrand Russell and swine like that, who have imposed a standard because of the British victory in World War I and the British victory in killing off the significance of Roosevelt after World War II. So we have destroyed those areas of scientific investigation. Most critically, go back to Planck, Einstein, and Wolfgang Köhler. These are the areas we should have been continued on. These areas were shut down. And you have a period from the 1890s, the beginning of the century, into the period of the post-war period. And the destruction of science was the destruction of investigation of questions which should have been asked. And the questions were already posed by Planck in his fundamental discovery. They were posed by Einstein, the whole concept of speed of light and the implications of that, Einstein and company. Then Köhler's conception of the human mind, which is crucial, and people who talk about Köhler make a mess of this whole thing, of Köhler's conception of the human mind. And you had Köhler's followers, so-called, fell into two categories, and it was on the question of the definition of the human mind that this difference occurred. Now, this idea of the definition of the mind goes efficiently to the question of what does space mean? What does time mean? What do all these things mean? Because the difference is human life. Life in general and human life. And what we've done, we've tried to explain this biologically. But biology doesn't explain anything. Biology is an interpretation of something we have not explained. And that's always a tricky thing in science. And therefore, I think that the speed of light, the question of the speed of light, looked at from the standpoint of what these geniuses were at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, and look at this question because we have a great experiment on our hands right now. The launching of this operation on Mars, this phase, even though it has precedents, it has certain peculiarities which distinguish it from the earlier precedents. Apart from the fact that man is an active principle now. The idea of life on Mars is there's no life there as such as we know it. But we have extended the idea of life as a factor in Mars history and functioning by man's intervention with a multi-phased, the number of degrees of freedom which are considered in this particular peace experiment just blow your mind out. Yeah, the other earlier experiments were fine, they were useful, they were provoking, they established certain principles. But this thing, the complexity of this vehicle, landing on Mars, opens things up widely. And it poses this question. Now we have a multi-phased instrument on Mars. We put it there, this thing, which means that we're now questioning how do we communicate and control a multi-phased piece of apparatus such as what we put on Mars? Well, there's only one way you can do it efficiently, speed of light. Well, we have the speed of light available to us. We use it, and we should monitor things by this method. We communicate with Mars in the time span which no other sense perception or anything else can deal with. So now we can begin to explore this process, the speed of light process, and we have a completely fresh view of the questions to be asked. And we can also means that we have to think about the advantage of what's the difference between the time span required to communicate with Mars by any other means except the speed of light. So we use the speed of light, and instead of relying upon sense perception, we use the speed of light to define what sense perception means. And that's the beginning, which means that we immediately have to get rid of this policy of the United States now and get into the supplemental experimental launches, which have to be done to crack these problems, which first came on the scene at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, reopen all the questions on this thing, throw these evil characters out of business, and get back on this. We have experiments to be conducted, which we are capable of defining if we build the experiments. And we can open up and redefine the whole issue. What is the meaning of life? There's no real understanding of that. We've never asked the right questions because there were too many questions we stopped asking and substituted other questions which were diversions. And I think this terrible period we're going through, which is going to shake everybody up. Now, we might lose the existence of the human species during this period. That's a risk that we have to consider. But assuming that we're going to continue to live as a human species, what should we do about it? And therefore, we've come to a point that it's only the stupidity of the human species, even people who are otherwise would you consider normally intelligent for normal things, and they don't function because they're trained not to function. And the great fight is that, my view of the remedy for that is if we can prevent the war from occurring, which the Joint Chiefs of Staff are doing a fairly heroic job in preventing, if we can get a decent president of the United States, which seems to be a very difficult proposition right now, then we can survive and we can go on and deal with these challenges and problems, which is what we should do. But there has to be much more inspiration among the population than I've seen now. We could start it up. Human beings, even with their wretched condition they're in now, we could start something up. But the initiative for that starting up is what's lacking, and is trying to find that initiative of stirring it up by whatever means we can. That's important. No, we have. I think we have. If we really are free in our minds, we really have with this what's happened on Mars. I think it's easy to underrate the significance, the psychological significance, and its practical implications of that, of this landing on Mars, because the increment in the revelations, which the very doing of it means, and what it means in terms of the speed of light correlative. This is enough to inspire a scientific revolution. Get this bum out of the presidency. Get a real non-obstacle to science in the presidency. And we can move the very horror of what we've escaped from with the recent presidents. We can find the inspiration. And we do have some of the knowledge needed to steer things in the direction of attention to things which will be fruitful. It's our best shot, and probably the only shot we have. My reading is that that Obama could be thrown out of the presidency, or at least not reelected, renominated, very soon, because there's a lot of instability. And thus, obviously, everything we discuss is going to be affected by what the prospects are as we go toward November. And in general, the environment, I would say, is that while it appears that the Democratic Party is coming up with a big effort here for the next election, I'm not so sure, because the Democrats are actually slipping behind in terms of the presidential race right now. What that means is uncertain, but it can...
And by two things. One is a video that we just put out on the site called Unsurvivable, which illustrates what a real thermonuclear war scenario looks like, and the immediate threat that we have of that unraveling very quickly within the next possible days to weeks to months under an Obama presidency.
Is the future of the United States. Because if Obama were reelected or even renominated, that is something bad. But if he were reelected, that's a threat to all humanity. And so we're coming into that kind of interesting period where we have to keep an eye on, shall we say, on everything we discuss. We have to keep an eye on this kind of consideration.
Yeah, I think it's important to just re-emphasize the real danger, the immediate danger we have with Obama being in the White House. I mean, the best of all possible events would be if the Congress would come back and yank Obama out immediately, and then we could actually rebuild the country from that standpoint. But the immediate threat is represented